Hi, everybody. My name is Ara Tapuzian. I'm the executive director for Michigan Venture Capital Association, and we're here today virtually for a year in review event, which is really different for us. I mean, this has been quite an interesting year that we've all had to go through, and so the reason that we're doing this event today is that obviously we're not be able to gather in person, and we typically would have our annual awards dinner in early November, and in light of that, we wanted to really sort of end the year on a positive note. And I think there are a lot of positive notes for us to really talk about. And it's important for us to acknowledge a lot of the achievements that have gone on here in Michigan. I'd like to thank our sponsors, GM Ventures, for sponsoring this event today. And then really quickly, all of our service providers that are part of MVCA. And that includes GDI Infotech, Sandrowski Corporate Advisors, Jaffe Wright, Hauer and Weiss, Pepper Hamilton, Varnum, Bodman, Gunderson Detmer, Bank of Ann Arbor, Fishman Stewart IP, Kerr Russell Attorneys, Gallagher Insurance, Plant Moran, Warner Norcross, and Judd. So I want to thank all of them for being continued supporters of MVCA. I've got the pleasure to talk with today our chair. He has been our steadfast chair this past year, and it's been a pleasure certainly to work with him. Mr. Michael Gross, who's the managing director at Beringia. Michael, thanks for being with us today, and looking forward to having a great conversation with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ara. I'm looking forward to it as well.
So before we start to really look at some of the highlights, maybe let's just, the elephant in the room is certainly the pandemic. It's why we're doing this today, but let's talk about this pandemic comparatively to other crises that you've been part of, other investors have been part of over the years. What are your thoughts on that?
So thanks, and obviously we can't do a year in review without talking about the big black swan event that has really dominated the headlines. But Ara, before we jump into the year in review, I did want to take a quick moment to really acknowledge the great work that you and Angela have done at the MVCA through the year. The pandemic affected everyone, and you had a great calendar of expanded in-person events ready to go. And it was really impressive to see you and Angela pivot and pull off a year of great content. So thank you for all of your efforts through the year.
Thank you.
I also wanted to take a moment to thank the board of directors of MVCA. As many of you know, we have an entirely volunteer board, and it's a great group that dedicates a tremendous amount of time and effort and enthusiasm in furthering the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Michigan. And it's a lot of hard work, and we really appreciate it. So Jeff Rinvelt, who is with Renaissance Venture Capital, is the vice chair and also the chair of our research committee, which puts out fantastic research report each year. Doug Neal with eLab Ventures is our treasurer, also a member of the executive committee of the board of directors, and is the chair of the talent committee, which is very important work that we do. Tom Shehab with Arboretum Ventures is our immediate past chair, and this year was the chair of our event committee, which had a pretty big curveball thrown at it. And Tom, this will be his last year serving on the board. We thank him for many years of great service and his support. Patty Glaza with Invest Detroit. Patty, Invest Detroit Ventures. Patty was the chair of our advocacy committee last year. And I'm really excited to announce Patty is going to be chairing our newly formed Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee this year. Really excited about the work that Patty and the committee are going to do in 2021. Adrian Fortino with Mercury Fund will now be the chair of our advocacy committee after chairing membership last year. And Adrian, while he's the chair of that committee, seems to have his fingers in many of our activities and committees. Evan Ufer with Plymouth Growth Partners will be chairing our membership committee. Kim Pasquino with Wake Stream Ventures provides great perspective and connectivity to the Grand Rapids community, which is increasingly a emerging in the venture scene and a very important geography for the Michigan community. Jim Addix with Venture Investors, previous board chair, our longest serving director, I think over a decade of service from Jim, which is just a tremendous amount of support. Fred Molnar with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. And, you know, MEDC has been such a great partner to MVCA and has done such great things in 2020 for the entrepreneurial community. And then lastly, Matt Sen with GM Ventures, and Matt took over this year for John Lochner upon his retirement. Really excited to have Matt on board and have that large corporate VC and the connectivity to his technical expertise is just great. So I just want to make sure I say thanks to everyone. It was a tough year. Everyone rolled up their sleeves and did a great job. And we really appreciate the hard work of the team and the board. So circling back to your question, yeah, obviously the pandemic dominated the headlines this year. And I kind of think back to our conversation, Ara, in April when we did the research report unveiling, and we had a lot of questions on how the pandemic was going to affect the venture community through the year. And, you know, those first days in March and early April when this was kind of unfolding, it's pretty scary times, right? You know, a lot of people said this reminds me of 9/11 and 2008 all combined in one. And there was some truth to that. You had kind of the human toll, the threat to our security, the pause of activity that we had from 9/11. And you had the just immediate financial dislocation from the financial crisis in 2008. So, you know, when we were sitting there in early April talking about the outlook for the year, there was a heck of a lot of uncertainty. And I think you asked, you know, what was different this time?
Yep.
And there were really two things that stand out to me that really changed the game for venture early in the pandemic. And first was the aggressive and kind of unprecedented intervention from the Federal Reserve to stabilize capital markets. I mean, you think about the stock market at that time, circuit breakers were broken daily on the downside, and it was like no end in sight. The Fed came in with kind of this massive liquidity package, which really stabilized public markets, allowed large strategics and public companies to draw massive low-cost debt facilities and stabilize their balance sheets and turn the tide up for valuations. And that's important for the venture market because it stabilized valuations for portfolio companies, and it also stabilized the economic position for large acquirers, which are very important to our ecosystem. And then the second thing that was clear was that the tech adoption cycles were being accelerated massively. You know, there are a lot of anecdotes about this, but many people will say it was 5 years of adoption in certain sectors overnight, because we as people just had to adapt. We had to embrace technology. And I think those two things really provided a backdrop of stability for the venture community, where we went from kind of the 2008 playbook of batten down the hatches, cut costs, draw your credit facilities, you know, prepare for this dark period, to a period of strength for certain subsectors and a bit of tailwind for certain VC subsectors. That's not to say there weren't companies that didn't fare well, and we certainly had some that will never recover because they were disproportionately affected by the nuances of the pandemic. But overall, I think, you know, when we sit here, you know, 9 months after this really unfolded, which seems like years, we can kind of say, you know, this was a strong year for the VC community in Michigan. And we'll see, we're going to have a couple tough quarters. The human toll is going to be significant over the next few months here. And it's going to be a tough time. But where we sit today as a venture community, entrepreneurship community, pretty stable and I think well-positioned for the future.
Right. And to your point, Michael, it's I don't know that we thought that back in March, right? I think there was a lot of major uncertainty, and it was gratifying in a way to just see how quickly people were able to pick up and move forward. So, I mean, everything you said, you know, makes perfect sense. And I was worried what our research would show us for next year, and now I'm very curious to see what that's going to end up doing. So, out of all of that, what do you think was maybe the biggest strength to come out of this past year?
Yeah, so we haven't done the research survey yet, and you make a good point. It'll be interesting to see the data when they come in. But I think one thing that definitely stands out where we are today is the breadth of exit activity throughout the community. And we talk a lot about exit activity, and it's a really important part of the venture ecosystem because it creates this virtual cycle of venture activity. So the entrepreneurs have success, their employees have success, they do well, they look to start their next company. The VCs have strong returns from those investments. They return capital to the LPs, and the LPs can then deploy that capital in additional alternative investments. And so you've got kind of this cycle that started from exit activity. And when we look at the exit activity in 2020, we have to talk about LlamaSoft being a billion-dollar plus exit, which is just so important. And we're coming off Duo Security in 2018. Now, 2 years later, we've got another venture-backed, homegrown billion-dollar plus exit, which really helps the ecosystem. And that was $1.5 billion deal for LlamaSoft. And congrats to Augment Ventures and MK Capital, Invest Detroit for being longtime supporters of LlamaSoft and getting a great outcome there. So I think that's really important because those billion-dollar exits locally help to solidify Michigan as a fertile ground for VC activity. And so it's important to have those events. And we certainly look forward to seeing how many companies kind of trickle out of the LlamaSoft story. But also we had other billion-dollar exits for Michigan-based VCs. The portfolio company of Ludlow Ventures, Honey, was sold to PayPal for $4 billion. So great outcome for the team at Ludlow. Really strong exit for them. And then Berengia's portfolio company, InTouch Health, was sold to Teladoc for a deal that closed at just over $1 billion as well. InTouch was a long pioneer in telehealth, and of course, the pandemic provided a significant tailwind for that market. So a lot of billion-dollar exits, which showed kind of that strength of activity in venture this year.
Yeah, and when you talk about LlamaSoft, and we don't have many of those unicorn exits here in Michigan, and certainly for something to come out like that, really in the, we're getting into the dead of winter of sorts, to have such an announcement like that is certainly amazing. And I had a chance to talk to Razat and hear the story, and that's going to come out soon in a podcast, but more on that a little bit later. So, Michael, okay, we're talking about these billion-dollar exits, but there's also a major strength in sort of the $1 million levels. And so it's been an impressive year, despite what we've been going through. Let's maybe address and talk about some of those big wins, in that $100 to $500 million range.
Sure. And yeah, we obviously, the headlines are those unicorn billion-dollar deals, but these exits in the 100 to 500 million range are just phenomenal outcomes for Michigan-based VCs and Michigan-based companies. And we had a number of those. I mean, in many years, you're happy to have kind of a few $100 million exits, and we had a number. Right. 100 to 500 range. And so some that stick out are Tetra Therapeutics, a Grand Rapids-based company. I know Invest Michigan was an investor in there, and some others here in the state. That was sold for $500 million. So really substantial outcome. Ann Arbor-based Pneumatics, a portfolio company of Arboretum, was acquired by Kyogen for $248 million. Just a fantastic outcome, and great to see Jeff Williams and his team for another success in the Michigan market. We've mentioned many times we like to see those kind of family tree exits, and that was a great one and another great win for Arboretum. Rethink Autism, a portfolio company of Arboretum and Berengia, had a great exit to K1, a leading private equity fund focused on SaaS and software investments. Ann Arbor-based Celsi was sold to Biorad for $160 million. And that was backed by a number of Michigan-based investors, Invest Michigan, Invest Detroit, Ann Arbor Spark, Telmara, and a host of others. And then we had Occupier go public on the NASDAQ through a reverse merger. So another great outcome for MENA and great success story. And when you look at those exits, those are all really meaningful transactions. Mm-hmm. I think one other trend that emerges is the strength in healthcare, medical technology, and life sciences, which has been a trend in Michigan for a number of years and is certainly strengthening.
Yeah, and I should really point out too that you're talking about these different deals that have occurred this last year and how we collected a lot of that. We may not have covered, and certainly in the time that we're allotting, we're not going to be able to cover every single deal that's really transpired. But starting next year, we're going to offer sort of a deal flow newsletter. This is something that we've asked our members about. They've wanted it. So a little bit of what we're doing now in kind of an email form. So we'll encourage folks to go to michiganvca.org. You could sign up to get our newsletter, and we're going to look to put that out quarterly next year. So if we don't touch on something that somebody in the audience knows about, certainly let us know, because we definitely want to get that information, because as we know, we're not a coastal community. And so the more info and the more news that we can get out there, certainly the better. So, when we talk about this investment activity and now over the fact that we're doing this through Zoom, and, certainly when I came here to MVCA, what I didn't realize was just how often all of you are flying and how often you are traveling. And so whereas I might have been used to sending an email or a phone call on a Monday and hearing on a Monday afternoon, I may have to wait 4 or 5 days because you're all traveling, you're all doing business meetings. Now with a pandemic and the lack of that, how do, VCs investing in companies that they don't meet in person? How does that even, how does that work? And how do you adapt to that? How do you try and get that connection? And then maybe the second part of that would, how does this play out for meaningful rounds? I mean, how, putting all this together, I mean, this is really a relationship industry of sorts. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question, Ara. And when I think back on our discussion in April, that was probably the big question. How would that in-person interaction affect the level of VC activity? And certainly, it's been great not to be flying this year, but it is tough to not be spending time with your portfolio companies and entrepreneurs. But when we look at the early data on this and some of the headlines, I think activity was pretty strong in the VC community for company rounds. You look at a company like Bloomscape, just announced a $15 million Series B round led by General Catalyst. So just a great Michigan-based company with strong Michigan VCs raising a nice Series B. Same with Floyd, another direct-to-consumer strong company here in Michigan, which had a Series B round catalyzed by Walden Ventures, a nice growth stage round. Shoulder Innovations closed a $21.6 million round, a medical device company in Grand Rapids, just a really nice round there. That was led by US Venture Partners and Lightstone. Envisix, a $50 million raise with GM Ventures participating. Genomenon had an oversubscribed bridge round close. Microlam rounded out their Series B investment at $5.5 million. So we had quite a few really meaningful growth stage rounds. And also, I'd be remiss to not mention Invest Detroit and kind of their prolific activity this year. I think it was 45 new portfolio companies backed by the team at Invest Detroit. So you had just really significant activity through the year. And I think there are a few categories of how that was achieved. Some of those relationships were already built pre-pandemic, and those deals then closed in Q2. And then we had a period of time over the summer where there was some safe outdoor in-person interaction, more relationships were built. And then I think VCs just adapted and companies adapted, and we're seeing rounds closed where there hasn't been that in-person interaction. So I think when we see the data next year, there will be some great activity on the investment side. And then back to the earlier comment on strength of healthcare and medical technology, I think when we look at those announced rounds that we highlighted, there are some industry themes emerging. So Bloomscape and Floyd are those category leading direct-to-consumer brands raising great scale rounds. Shoulder Innovations and Genomenon furthering that life sciences and med tech strength for Michigan. Microlam on the advanced manufacturing side, a really important industry here, and then Envisix in the auto tech space. So a lot of good industry diversification.
Yeah, definitely. We should, there's more than just the investment side, right? We should probably talk about the people that make it all that special.
I think that's great. I tend to focus on the deal activity and being in the trenches on that. So maybe I'll turn it over to you. In your role as executive director of MVCA, you see everything happening in the community. What has stood out to you as some of the highlights?
Definitely there's a number of them, combination of, let's say emerging just strong talent in the VC arena, a couple of shining stars, if you will, Camilla Nordelos from Grand Ventures. Camilla, if I butchered your name, I'm so sorry, but it's always possible on my end. But she received the 40 under 40 from the Grand Rapids Business Journal this past year. Dan Kittle from Arboretum Ventures was a rising star. He got that award from the National Venture Capital Association. And then I think, again, we talk about just the responsiveness of both the investment and innovation community to COVID. I think we've seen a lot of companies that have really sort of jumped to attention, whether it is helping out with, materials, PPP, and so forth. I think that we've seen a lot of great response to it. And, with MVCA early on, we definitely looked at how do we help out? And so a lot of number of you board members and committee members donated to a number of the different funds early on in the year, but then you also volunteer time, which is very important. And so we worked with the MEDC smart zones that are throughout the state, and you folks and so forth were instrumental in talking to entrepreneurs during this time. You're busy working with your own portfolio companies, but you guys took the time to really look at the entrepreneurs across the state. So I think that was really important. And then I just think there's been a better response and a genuine focus and look at diversity. You talked about earlier that we're developing a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee that's important to us. It's not the first time we've looked at diversity, but certainly I think we're taking even a greater active role in what does that look like. So, but under that, I think we've seen two great funds come out of it. One is the New Community Transformation Fund out of Grand Rapids. They partnered with The Right Place. We did a webinar on that a month or so ago to really educate folks on what they're doing. And then there's Commune Angels, which is also a new fund out there. So we're definitely seeing a lot of that. And certainly, again, the folks at Invest Detroit in Green Angels, they have diverse teams. This is what they do on a daily basis. And, kudos to them for doing that. Doesn't mean we stop there. And I think that there's a lot for us really to do. And certainly us as an organization, we're looking at that and taking a hard look to, how do we become effective and how do we become a real player in really furthering a lot of that. We've done Michael, we talk about some of the things that MVCA has done sort of in the past year, and because we had to adjust, we've had a lot of these webinars. I think we jumped onto that pretty early, but they were really relevant topics. It wasn't all on COVID.
Mhm.
And one of, a number of those we have talked about is really the lack of fund availability for people of color, for female founders, and these are things that we sort of covered and talked about, and we're going to still continue that conversation. I alluded to, as we're kind of wrapping this up, I alluded to that we started a podcast, Michigan VC Talk, that I host, that we're already in the midst of recording. Maybe we'll even use this as a podcast episode for the future, but we're interviewing investors, entrepreneurs, folks that are in the Michigan ecosystem, that are making a difference, that are really helping, push forward and to grow a diverse state. Couple other quick things too. Our landscape guide, which is very important for the entrepreneurial community. We have released that. It's up. A brand new one is up on our website right now as we speak. This is a valuable resource. It's not just shows you a directory, but really talks in depth of the work that each of these investors do, also entrepreneurial support resources and whatnot. So it's free, it's downloadable. You should definitely go on to michiganvca.org to see that information. Again, I'll recap that we talk about doing a deal flow newsletter and certainly our annual research report. We've been doing that for 14, 15 years. So we're looking forward to that. Michael, we're like 3 minutes out. How would you conclude this? What are your thoughts on maybe next year?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I think you brought up some really good topics. The talent in the community that's being recognized, and certainly the focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And really, it's a shame that COVID was such a overwhelming story this year, because I think the fight for racial justice and racial equity is such an important story, and the sustained protests have really raised awareness across the country. And so I agree, it was great to see those new funds formed, and the communities being extremely intentional about increasing diversity. And so I'm really looking forward to 2021 and carrying that conversation on and making that the real story of 2021. And so I think that's a really exciting theme for the future for the Michigan venture community. And we've got a lot of work to do, like you mentioned. So hopefully, we power through these next few months and this next quarter, and we get the vaccines, and we can start to return to some level of normal, whatever that looks like in this new world. But we'll all benefit from this massive tech adoption, and I think our companies will be stronger for it, and we as a society will be stronger for it. And so, it's kind of exciting to think about what 2021 can produce if we can move through this. And there still is a lot of COVID to get through, but I feel confident we'll get through it as a community, and I think we'll continue to thrive. And I look forward to the research report next year and seeing the actual data from this year that'll be more comprehensive than what we discussed today. But really look forward to seeing that data, seeing how we fared in 2020, and seeing if we can get another record year on the books in 2021.
Definitely. And I think we're all looking forward to returning where Michael, I haven't seen you since last February. I see you on this, but I haven't seen you in person. So I'm looking forward to a day where I can either fist bump you, shake your hand, or whatever it is again. But we're looking forward to, we're planning our year as aggressively as possible. We hope to return for our annual awards dinner next November at the Henry Ford. And so we've got information going out on that. Real quickly, we want to thank all of you for watching this today. We've had a number of guests that have tuned in just to hear what's going on in the ecosystem, and we're very appreciative to all of you for taking the time out today to do that. But it's not done yet. So we're going to move into a virtual networking component. We've got a number of different rooms. You'll be give Michael and I a couple of minutes to. We're going to have to run from virtually one room to another to get going. But you'll see on the left side, that you'll I think of your panel that you'll be able to leave the stage area and go into these sessions. And so don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back. And again, thank you very much. And Michael, thank you.
You're welcome, Ara, and thanks everyone for joining. I think one additional detail on the breakout rooms, there are a number of different rooms. There are letters on top of each room. Those letters correspond to the first letter in your first name. So go by first name, jump into that room. That way we can spread out the participation. And Ara, thank you so much for having me. Really, really great to recap the year, and I look forward to the networking event.
Great. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.